Michael Claener has a wealth of experience in sales and marketing, business development, and human resources. If you plan to purchase a franchise, this is the guy you got to talk to. Claener has negotiated over 300 different types of arrangements, including dozens upon dozens of different franchises. A graduate of the Executive MBA program at Queen's University, our guest addresses some of the issues that he has confronted in the negotiating process, including the importance of due diligence, agenda formation, the need for a comprehensive but succinct opening statement, coping with silence and deadlocks and impasses, as well as several other issues. My name is David Dingwall, your host, and I welcome you to the Ryerson Negotiation Project. In your experience as an executive, you've negotiated well over 300 different types of franchises and franchise locations in Canada as well as in the United States. As a general approach to negotiations, how would you describe your negotiating style?
Well, I would say my negotiating style is one of two things. I'm firm when I need to be, and I'm conciliatory when I need to be. So it's really a mix of both firmness or aggressiveness along with being conciliatory. And the way I really manage that is the first thing you have to realize before you enter into any negotiation, you have to understand the people who you're negotiating with. You really need to get as much background information as you can on them, both with respect to their personalities, their negotiating style, and certainly their hot buttons and things that may concern them well ahead of time. And you can only do this by doing proper research well ahead of time before you enter into the negotiation.
Perhaps I could ask you this question. In terms of your approach to a particular negotiation, whether it's a franchise for a head lease or indeed a sublease, where do you get your mandate? Perhaps you could share with us as to how you get that mandate. Would your mandate, for instance, would it be in writing, if in fact there is a mandate? Or would it be stated to you orally? And what, if any, restrictions would you have on your mandate in terms of proceeding with the negotiations?
Okay, well, first of all, the mandate would be developed from the strategic plan. The annual strategic plan of the organization would decide we're going to open so many new locations or acquire a piece of land that we may bank for future development. That has a budget naturally attached to it.
So as an executive, you would be very familiar with the strategic plan for the fiscal year going forward.
I would actually have been part of producing that strategic plan. I would have been part of the process. Now, in the organizations that I worked in, I'm very pleased to say we actually took the strategic planning process very, very seriously from the standpoint that we actually reviewed the strategic plan at the end of every quarter. So it wasn't something that we stuck in a desk, dusted it off a year later and looked at. Each quarter we look at it, look where we are, make any revisions we need to the strategic plan based on current conditions. And that mandate would either change in terms of the number of facilities we're going to open, it might increase if we're having a better year, or it might just stay at the current level that was originally decided upon when we put the plan together.
So this written mandate, we're going to call it the strategic plan, but this written mandate, would it have restrictions placed on it for you as the head negotiator in order to achieve a successful opening of a new franchise?
Well, I had a $10 million approval, so I could execute anything, sign all the documents myself, bind the company for anything up to $10 million.
So there was a monetary restriction in terms of, and then what would happen after that? Say, for instance, you exceeded 10 million. It went to 15 million. Would you have to go back and get approval?
Yes. Well, actually, if you did that, you'd need to go back and get approval, but really you had to know well ahead of time because that had to go to the board. So when you started the project, one of the things that I was very, very concerned about was not having cost overruns. And I'm very proud to say I didn't have that happen. We were very, very careful. We took on projects that we knew could come in within the budgeted numbers that we put forth, and we managed it very, very carefully. I had one instance And I can tell you it was in Orillia, Ontario, where we actually acquired a piece of land. Unbeknown to us, in that acquisition, the land had a water table running under it. And that required a lot of fill. The fill was over $1 million. For some reason, we didn't know that before that acquisition happened, and this was a problem that I had inherited. So we really couldn't go ahead and develop that property at the time that we planned to do it because of the amount of money that was required just to fill it in.
Other than the monetary restriction on your authority to negotiate, would your board or senior management, your colleagues, put other restrictions on you in terms of your particular negotiations? Or was it just the monetary restriction?
It was just the monetary, but anytime I negotiated, I backed everything up with writing, and I always put a sentence within the letter which said, subject to final approval by our executive committee or by our board. I always had an out. I didn't need it, but I always had it.
So that's quite interesting. So if you're dealing with another party,
Right.
That party would say you would negotiate, but at the end of the negotiations or in the beginning of the negotiations, they would see that notwithstanding the good faith that you were embarking upon and they were embarking upon, there was a clause that said it's all subject.
Right. And that's because if there were any surprises on their part in the end, or before we got to the end, we at least had an escape route.
Tell us about the preparation that you, as the head negotiator, would have to do for negotiating the different franchises. What sort of things did you do? Would you have any incidents or stories that you could share with us in terms of your preparation?
Absolutely. The preparation was very, very extensive. First of all, before you open a franchise, you need to have a proper location. In order to decide upon a location, you really need to have market research. The market research is not something you pull out of a hat. You use both internal and external resources to do that. I had a team of people that included a director of business development. I had a business analyst. I had an internal researcher who basically worked with external bodies, capturing information that we required in order to have the information we need to support that a market was there, that if we opened a facility, that it would be viable in that location. Once you had that, the next step was to marry a franchisee to the location. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because you need to have somebody that not only has the right investment, but the correct attitude, the willingness to do it, the drive to do it. And I can come in, or anybody can come in and tell you anything. The best way to do that is have an interview with the person, then do some testing. And the testing would be done either with a psychologist or written tests that would be submitted to a psychologist who would score them and tell you the person's a fit for what you're looking for or they're not a fit.
So that's a pretty extensive approach to your negotiation process. You would have a team.
Yes.
You would have outside research.
Absolutely.
Validated obviously by a reputable company.
Correct.
You would have your own internal researcher who would process that,
Yes.
question that type of research. Also in the franchising business is that you would give a thorough examination of the potential applicant. Now, would all of this kind of preparation, research, would this all take place before you actually sat down with the individual to negotiate about the particular franchise?
Yes, absolutely. Well, no, you first of all, let me qualify that. The person submits an application. Once we get the application, we have an initial interview.
What sort of goals would you set in terms of in preparing for the negotiations?
Well, the goal.
Or did you establish goals? That's probably the better question.
No, absolutely. We did establish goals. And one of the goals I must tell you is you always have a defined number of people and locations that you hope to marry candidates to. The first thing I'll tell you is you obviously need more candidates than you have locations, because for whatever reason, somebody may not be willing to locate in a certain area where you're trying to open a new business. They may not have the skills to particularly operate that particular unit, but perhaps one of a lower volume which has less demands on it. So you really have to be very, very careful. Now, in a good franchise system, you have to care about the individual and the well-being of the organization. You're not just selling franchises praying that the person's going to survive, and then they fail and they close, and potentially your outlet is closed for a while. That doesn't help you. And I can tell you, once a business closes in an area, it's very, very hard to reopen it. Extremely hard. You lose all kinds of credibility with the customer base.
So in interviewing the potential applicant for the franchise, they would submit an application.
Right.
You would go through some testing of that particular individual.
Right.
And then you would sit down with that individual and go through their application. Am I correct on that?
We would, and part of that application is a financial process, and of course we have to verify that they have the money. And one of the people on the team, the financial analyst, works with our chief executive officer to ensure that they have what they're purporting, that they say that they have, free and clear. And before I got to the company, they were embarrassed. They actually took somebody on board that had just gone through a bankruptcy and didn't know and approved him as a franchisee. Went into business and he failed very, very quickly within a 3-month period. So one of the things that I did when I joined that particular firm was put some policies and procedures into place. And one of them was, we must verify that the candidate has the funds that they purport to have to support the business. And with any new business, you not only need to have the funds to open it, but if things are a little slower for a few months, you need to have enough money to be able to ride through that period. So enough cash to put in it. A lot of people feel when you open a business, they're automatically rich, and that's not the case at all. Most businesses take 2 to 3 years to root before you're even going to turn a profit. And that's just the way it is. And
so did you build that into the franchisee?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So contingencies would have to be available, and who would provide those? Would it be the franchisee?
The franchisee.
The franchisee.
The franchisee. Now, what we didn't want to do would we put anybody into business that was undercapitalized, because if we did that, we knew they were going to run into trouble.
Tell me about patience. Is this an important aspect of the negotiating process? And if so, could you share with us any examples that you might have?
Absolutely, absolutely. Patience, obviously, when you look at negotiating with somebody, first of all, you have to understand the other side, and you have to appreciate and respect their feelings. Both sides have an objective, and I always say before you start any negotiation, you have to make sure both sides in fact want to do it. And you have to establish that right up front in your first meeting. Do we want to negotiate this? In doing so, you have to appreciate the fact that the other side may move more slowly than you want to move. And if you're not patient with them, you're going to have a much tougher time getting a deal than if you're not. So you have to listen, be caring, be concerned, be willing to respond to any requests that they have. No matter how frivolous you may feel it may be, you've got to really sit back and not let emotion get involved in the situation at all. Make proper notes and get back to them with whatever it is that they're concerned about.
So I take it from what you're saying is that in your negotiations, you've been fairly patient.
Yes.
And you've taken notes during your discussions with the other side?
Absolutely.
Would your team members take notes as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll give you a classic example. There was a competitor in Winnipeg, Manitoba we wanted to buy out. And our competition wanted to buy that same competitor. And they were very, very pushy with him. And he didn't have to go anywhere. His business was solid. And he just didn't like the competition. Anytime I went to Winnipeg, I used to go in and visit him and talk to him. Not about buying his business, but asking how things were. We got to know one another. We got to respect one another. And over time, one day when I went in, I could see he was very, very frustrated. He was very, very frustrated because he wasn't getting the parts that he needed. He had a backup in the washroom. He had a number of customers that had problems that weren't getting resolved. And I said to him, If you ever want to consider moving on and selling your business, we'd be happy to speak to you at any time, and we're not going to pressure you, but look, let's stay in touch. I give that to you to think about. I left the building. I went back about 3 months later to see how he was doing. Make a long story short, I stayed in touch with him for a year and a half. And one day he called me and he said, I've had it. I want out of here. A number of things had happened. I flew out to Winnipeg immediately with my team of 5 people. We put a deal together. I worked with our law firm, and I can tell you at the time our law firm was Smith, Lyons and Torrance. Documents were going back and forth by fax. We got the deal signed. I had the funds wired in, and we acquired it. We sat there for 4 days and got it done.
So you would attribute that to your patience?
Absolutely, absolutely. Everybody else was pushy with him, and he just didn't want to deal with them.
In your negotiations, were you apt to make the first offer, or would you have the other side make the first offer?
It would depend. I think in some cases we would make the first offer. Now, in other cases we may not, and I'll describe that to you. I'm one, and everybody has a different negotiating style. I believe you have to put a fair offer on the table at some point. I don't think you need to lowball the offer to the point where you could potentially offend the other side. So my position was always put a fair offer on the table, but have some bullets of things in it that you're quite prepared to give up. It's a negotiating tactic. So here are 5 things I'm going to put in there, knowing full well they may raise it, and if they raise it, we'll give those up because everybody has to have a win-win.
Would you deem that your part of your concession strategy?
Yes, absolutely. But it would be in the document up front.
So in terms of your first offer, though,
Yes.
it would be a realistic offer, a fair offer?
It would be a fair offer with a little bit of room to move, but it would have other bullets in there that we were quite willing to give up.
What was the dangers in not offering a fair offer?
I think the danger in not offering a fair offer is that you offend the person you're negotiating with, and they potentially go to market and look for somebody else. And I've seen that happen. And very early in my career, I had something happen down in the Windsor area myself. That was, we didn't put a fair offer on the table, and the owner got offended.
Now, you mentioned your concession strategy, 4 or 5 bullets that you would have that you could give up. But is there not a danger of giving too much away? Does it look like you're not being realistic?
No, well, first of all, and let me explain that to you, we were very, very careful with our research. We knew where the market was. So we came in below it, but not too much below it where we would offend the person we were negotiating with. So remember I spoke about how thorough our research was. We knew exactly where the market was. When I went to speak to a landlord, I commissioned appraisals completed by an accredited appraisal company that worked in that particular market. So I had concrete information of deals that were negotiated in the area on similar businesses. I knew that. He didn't know I had it until at some point I may disclose that I have it further on down the negotiation.
Communications with the other party and internally. What was your preferred way to communicate? Are you an email type of person? Were you a letter, fax, in person, combination of all? Tell us a little bit about your style in terms of how you would communicate internally as well as communicating with the other side prior to actually sitting down to the negotiations.
Well, internally was very, very simple. We had a meeting every morning at 7 o'clock in the office. My team and myself would sit down, and we would talk about anything that we were working on as a team. So if there was a negotiation that we were about to enter into or one that we just come out of, we would all compare notes. We would update each other as to where we are in the process. So if somebody had a follow-up issue that we had to provide an answer, I wanted to get that answer and all that communication actually went from my office out to the party we were negotiating with. So somebody on the team had to bring me the information. I, in turn, responded to the party we were negotiating
And how
with.
did you do that? Was it over the phone? Was it by fax? Or
By letter, typically sent either by email or by fax. Sometimes I might make a phone call ahead of time to tell them what it is, but as part of the file, I wanted to have something in the file to show that we responded on such and such a date. And the only way I could do that was either have a note, a handwritten note or a note in there, or an actual letter, and I preferred to have an actual letter that was either sent by courier or by fax or hand delivered in some other way.
perhaps you could share with us either stories or your views in terms of what significance you attribute to developing a good relationship with the other side. I think you mentioned the gentleman in Winnipeg.
Yes.
Could you care to elaborate on the importance of relationships?
Sure. Well, I'll give you even a greater example. One of the firms that I was with had a number of locations in BC. The locations were owned by a member of the Bentall family, who's very well known. The organization prior to my joining it really had a fiery relationship with this individual because he believed in the system so much he had a number of franchises, and he did something that he shouldn't have done, and he lost the franchises. The company didn't handle that well, and what happened is they basically terminated his franchise agreement, and 4 years later his locations came up for lease renewal, and he didn't want to talk with them at all. His position was, now I'm going to kick you out, and I'll go in there and open up what I want to open up. I'd been on board about a year before these negotiations were about to come up on these particular locations, and there were 5 of them, and they were very, very high volume. In fact, the 5 of them represented 22% of the volume we did in BC, which was very high. So I went out and I befriended him. Casual meetings with him. Nothing about the leases coming up. Got to know him. Got to understand him as a person. And as a result of that, I had a number of appraisals commissioned. When the time came, which was 6 months before the locations all came up for renewal, we had to notify our interest in renewing in writing. I sent him a letter, registered letter, saying that we wanted to negotiate. And I went out with appraisals in hand, and I sat down with him in his office. And he sat down and he spoke to me about the past. And he said, you know, I have an axe to grind with the company, but I don't have an axe to grind with you. I think you're a very sincere and honorable person. He said, I don't even need to look at those. What are you going to offer me on each of the locations? And I told him. We shook hands and he said, it's done. It was a half-hour meeting. Now, the company was sure we were going to be out of there. They were dead sure we were going to be out of there, but I'd taken the time to build a relationship with them and mend the fences as best I could without bringing up the past. I wanted to show him that we were sincere as an organization. We cared about him, we wanted to be there, and that it was in his best interest and our best interest to have us there.
Any other examples as to where relationships were sour and as a result the business soured?
Yes. We had one with a company that I was with in New Brunswick, in the area of Moncton, New Brunswick, and the relationship soured and the business soured, and we lost the location and the business. It was one where the individual that was in business had owned the property. They came to us. The proper land control was not put in place, meaning we didn't ask for an option to lease, or we didn't head lease it and sublease it back to him, which would have been the proper protocol. Relationship soured, and he kicked us out and put up the competitor's banner. And we lost a significant amount of business in that market. Moncton's a very small market when you look at it. We had 3 locations there. We lost our largest volume location due to that.
Would you agree with the statement that relationships are essential in terms of negotiations? but they do take a fair amount of time.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you don't have a good relationship, you can't expect to get a deal done. If the person, either party, doesn't respect one another, it's not going to happen.
Don't have to like one another.
No, but respect one another in terms of what you're trying to do, what the objective is. When I say like one, if you don't respect one another and you're both, if there's emotion in the way, it's not going to happen. You got to get somebody else in to take over. And I had a set of circumstances once where I was the wrong guy to be at the table, and I knew that. I brought somebody else in from the team, let him negotiate it, and we got the deal. And sometimes you have to say, okay, I'm not the right person for whatever reason. Don't get emotional about it. Step away. Let somebody else come in and handle it. And that's not a problem.
Tell me about probing. Have you been involved in negotiations where either the franchisee that you were dealing with or the landlord that you were dealing with, whatever the case was, is that you had to probe, you had to ask a lot of questions, you had to get clarification? Have you encountered issues or situations where you've had to probe, and whether or not that was significant and helpful to achieving your objective?
Absolutely. I would say, particularly on the franchisee side and on the landlord side in some instances, but more so on the franchisee side, we really had to probe to get substantiation of the fact that they had whatever it was they were going to say they had in terms of not only finances but experience. We wanted to validate it. And if the person wasn't forthcoming, we'd continue to probe. We'd ask for a letter from the bank stating they had what they had in their account. We would then go to the bank with that letter to verify it at some point before we finalized the deal. But all these things were done up front, and some people would come in and be very forthcoming, and other people wouldn't be forthcoming. And those that weren't forthcoming, I always looked at as potentially somebody that was going to be a problem because there's something hidden here. In some cases I was wrong, in some cases I was right. Just took some more probing to get the information from them. It's as simple as that. But if you don't do your homework and validate, you're going to be in trouble.
Now, Michael, tell us, or share with us, I should say, some of your best persuasive techniques. What have you used constantly over the years in terms of your negotiations to be persuasive with the other side in terms of your particular case?
Well, I think in my case, and not only in my case, I would say in anybody's case, you really have to come across as being sincere, caring, and wanting to do whatever it is you're intending to do. That's the first advice I would give anybody. Secondly is understanding and being considerate of the other side. Be aggressive when you need to be aggressive. Dig your heels in when you need to. When you can be conciliatory, be conciliatory. Don't expect it. Don't expect any situation to come together if it's all I want, I want, I want. You got to give. There has to be a win-win. And I would say that if you understand that there has to be a win-win, it's going to happen if you work towards that. And if you don't work towards that, probability is it's not going to happen.